All right, our recording is in progress. So again, welcome everyone tonight. As we begin our gathering tonight, we want to take the time to acknowledge that we are each attending remotely from the homelands of many different tribal nations. I myself am currently on the traditional homelands of the Swinomish, the Upper Skagit, the Inklaka'am, and the Sauk Suiattle, and likely others whose names have been lost through time and the ages. I want to pay respect to these people, past and present, and extend that respect to their descendants and to all Indigenous people. To acknowledge the land is to recognize its longer history and our place in that history. It is to recognize these lands and waters and their significance for the people who've lived and continue to live in this region, whose ways of life and spiritual practices are and were tied to the land and water, and whose lives continue to enrich and develop in relationship to the land, waters, and other inhabitants today. So I encourage you to take a moment and write into the chat the traditional homelands that you are tuning in from today, if you know whose homelands you're tuning in from. And if you don't, I encourage you to take the time to look that up and get engaged with the area that you are currently living or tuning in from today. And I see some chat coming in, folks tuning in from Metau and Samish, Hawaiian, Spokane, Lummi, Puyallup, Lummi and Nooksack and Coast Salish, Wenatchee, Lummi. Awesome. Thank you everyone for sharing. And thank you for being here in this virtual program. Being a part of this virtual program means that you're helping to support our mission to inspire environmental stewardship through transformative learning experiences in nature. And tonight we have the privilege of welcoming Bill Gaines. Bill is a wildlife ecologist and the director of the Washington Conservation Science Institute. He has been involved in wildlife research and conservation for the past 3 decades. And he's conducted a number of research projects specifically on bears and other large carnivores, working both internationally and nationally. Bill has been involved in efforts to study and restore carnivore populations, including the grizzly bear, in the North Cascades. And he currently resides in Leavenworth with his family. So without further ado, I want to welcome Bill.
Thank you so much, Hannah, and thanks everyone for sharing your evening and hearing about one of my favorite topics, which is, of course, bears. Let me see if I can get this screen up. Yeah. Get my presentation going here. Okay, can that see my screen? Did it pop up, Hannah? Look good?
Yep, you
Okay.
got it.
All right. Well, thank you. And the story I want to share with you tonight is about a particular project that I was involved in, from about the 2010 or so when we first started doing this work till around 2017. The most intense years were those first 4 or 5 years of the project, and it was around using some kind of innovative technologies, carrying some crazy big packs into some really remote places, all parts of the North Cascades in search of this elusive animal that we call the grizzly bear. We're really interested in understanding more about if there were any left, and if so, how many were there, and where were they in this vast and wild ecosystem. To do that, I want to start with a little bit of background about the Cascades, a little history around kind of what we know, the story of grizzly bears here in the North Cascades, and then share a little bit of just general kind of ecology, so we get to know the animal a little bit more and understand then a little bit more about some of both the opportunities and the challenges in trying to manage and restore an animal and a population like a grizzly bear population. So let me start with a little bit about the North Cascades. What this place we call the North Cascades Ecosystem is 6.5 million acres in size. It's one of the largest blocks of contiguous public lands that remains in the lower 48. It extends down along the I-90 corridor all the way north to the Canadian border. And it includes national forests and parks, wilderness areas, a lot of very, very special places that we here in the Northwest have fallen in love with. It's quite a beautiful, magical area. Um, it's an ecosystem that's co-managed with our fellows across the border in British Columbia, our counterparts. They have about 3 million acres that abut the North Cascades that they also manage for grizzly bears. So in total, it's a very large ecosystem. Um, and it has about 40 to 50% of it is either wilderness or in a roadless condition. So it's also remote and wild. And those are ingredients that are necessary, large areas of public land, wildness. Those are kind of the ingredients that you need to even think about trying to recover and restore a population of a wild animal that covers a lot of ground, like grizzly bears and other carnivores. So it's the uniqueness of this large, vast area that makes it even possible to think about recovering grizzly bears. And something that I've learned in my work, not only in the US, but around the world, is that those opportunities where we do have that vast wildness, they're growing slimmer and slimmer. And so it's a fairly unique opportunity here to think about having a full complement of these wild carnivores like bears and wolves and wolverines and other large animals. We start with a little bit of history, just kind of talk about kind of the history of the Cascades and what that has meant for carnivores like bears and wolves and other species. This is an image of a trapper cabin, and this was taken right around the early 1900s. It's actually a photo that was taken along in Lake Chelan. And you can see there's a number of furs hanging up on the side of this old cabin. If you look really closely at these, I have a big blow up of this photo, and I can see on there a number of bears, wolverines, cougars, lynx and bobcat, coyotes, possibly some wolves. It's very hard to see in this photo. Over on the very far left of the photo is a very large bear hide. Looks very grizzly-ish. Um, we know from reconstructing trapping records, really quite detailed trapping records that were kept by the Hudson Bay Fort company, Hudson Bay Company, the fur company. They had 4 forts that they operated around the North Cascades. A couple of them just across the border in British Columbia, and a couple of them in Washington. We know from those records that in about a 20-year period in the mid 1800s, they processed nearly 4,000 grizzly bear hides through those forts. We know that that was likely a very significant impact on the grizzly bear population in the North Cascades. Not all of those grizzly bear hides came from what we currently call the North Cascades. They probably came from broader areas, but certainly a number of them did. And some of the very best grizzly bear habitat is in the North Cascades. So that had an initial pretty substantial impact on the grizzly bear uh, in Washington. And then as we move on into the 1920s, all the way up to the 1950s, and a new uh, uh, group of folks began interacting with these big animals. And these were the government trappers. Government trappers were paid to remove large carnivores like wolves and bears. And in large part for protection of livestock, because now there were animals grazing on the national forest lands. There were also concerns about how wolves and bears might interact with deer and elk populations. And so it was kind of a common thought that the best thing to do was to remove these carnivores and kind of make the ecosystem better. Um, and they were very good at what they did. This is one of the trappers. He was actually a forest ranger that was worked on the Mount Baker Snoqualmie. This is Pete Peterson, And in the 1920s, he tracked this bear in all around, spent most of the summer tracking this bear in and around the Mazama area. And eventually late in that summer was able to shoot this bear. And we know from records that we collected from these government trappers that kind of reconstructing the history there, that there were not a lot, but a fair number of bears that were taken by these government trappers. Probably the reason there weren't more was because that initial trapping effort in the mid-1800s had already had a pretty major impact on the grizzly bear population. So these folks were more just kind of finishing them off, if you will. We know that the last grizzly bear was legally shot in the North Cascades Park in 1967. And since then, we just get a very few trickle of sightings here and there. The story that I just told about the history of bears in the North Cascades is one that's very common throughout many of the Western states. And in fact, grizzly bear numbers and their habitat have shrunk down to about 2% of their historical range. Historically, they extended all the way through the Western US, excuse me, all the way down to central Mexico. And now they are just located in a handful of places in in the Northwest and in Montana and Idaho. Um, I'll talk about the status of grizzly bears in the North Cascades, the Selkirks in Northeast Washington and Northern Idaho, a very small number there. They're connected to bears, a larger number of bears in BC, but probably fewer than 30 or 40 bears on the US side. The Cabinet Yaak ecosystem in Northwest Montana, a bigger population, probably 50 to 60 bears there, also connected to a bigger population in Canada. One of the largest populations of the lower 48 is in the area in and around Glacier National Park, probably well over 1,000 bears now. So that population has grown and is doing quite well. And then Yellowstone is somewhere probably in several hundred, 500 to 700 bears, somewhere in that range, the second largest population. The area that you see in Idaho, the Bitterroot ecosystem, it's identified as a recovery area, but it doesn't have any grizzly bears in it at this point in time. Again, it's a large block of public lands. And then I'll share with you what we've learned about the status of grizzly bears here in the North Cascades. So these are the recovery areas where there have been efforts underway in some places for many, many years to try to restore the grizzly bear populations to a portion of their former range. Here in the North Cascades, we still get occasional sightings, tracks or a sighting, a photo, just enough sort of to make us wonder, just what's going on out there. And so because of the evidence that would suggest we might still have a few, but the lack of a really substantial effort or a rigorous effort to try to understand how many we have, we just, for many, many years, we didn't really know that much about if there were any left, where they were, but just we would get on a yearly basis something like this. This photo was taken by a person hiking in the wilderness. You can see the bear in there. It looks like it has a large hump. It actually turns out it is actually a brown colored black bear. But there are many cases where we get photos like this, and most of the time we can determine which species it is, but there are a few we get every year where it's really difficult. So we just couldn't really say much about how many grizzly bears we might have here in the Cascades. So our idea was to maybe go about it in a more systematic way, and I'll share with that in a little bit. If we go just north of the border, within a few miles of the border, there's better evidence to show that there still are grizzly bears present there. This is a photo that was taken. It was actually a study of a wolverine, and it had some camera and a little bit of scent on a piece of wood. And this bear came in to investigate it. It kind of stood on its haunches and it posed real nice and showed us its nice white claws, which is a very telling characteristic of grizzly bears, which I'll talk about here in a minute. And we have a number of other really solid confirmed evidence of a handful of grizzly bears across the border. However, there aren't many. The North Cascades grizzly bear on the British Columbia side is their most threatened population of grizzly bears in British Columbia. So even though the evidence is better, it's still it's still not a rosy picture, if you will, for grizzly bears' future there on the British Columbia side. So just what is this thing we call a grizzly bear? So let me just share with you a little bit of information about grizzly bears, and I'll kind of compare them back and forth a little bit to black bears because most of us are have seen a number of black bears as we hike around out there, and they're fairly common. There's a number of physical characteristics that we look for when we get something like a photo or somebody describes an animal that they saw that they thought was a grizzly bear. Probably most common is that I often get a call, I saw a grizzly bear, and my first question is, why did you think it was a grizzly bear? And they'll say, because it's brown. And we know from a lot of the research that we've done on black bears in the Cascades that especially on the east side of the Cascades, something on the order of 70% of the black bears are not black, they're brown, or some version of brown, blonde to real light colored blonde to almost a reddish color. So there's quite a variety of coat colors on the east side. A little less so on the west side, probably just the opposite, where 70% of the bears are black. And then but there still are a number that are something other than black. So probably an adaptation to a local environment. But color isn't a real good indicator. In addition, some grizzly bears can be quite dark in color. So we have to rely on some other things. Uh, I mentioned the long claws. The long claws are actually a really good tool to look at, to look for. Fortunately, grizzly bears, when they dig, they're very prodigious diggers. And when they do that, they actually wear out the outer portion of their claw and they expose an under layer that's much lighter in color. And so you don't have to be real close to a grizzly bear to see those claws. You can see them from a fair distance like that photo showed. So that's another good indicator. Black bear claws are much shorter. They don't dig as much and they're generally quite dark. We also look at the hump. The hump is a good indicator as well. We have to be a little careful because sometimes we can be fooled by that. But a hump is a muscle mass. Grizzly bears, like I mentioned, they're such good at digging. They dig for food and they dig up animals. They dig roots and tubers. Those long claws are like shovels on their hands, and they dig so much they develop a muscle mass. It's kind of like pumping iron. They're lifting weights, and they develop this big muscle mass across their shoulders. Um, and so that hump is a good indicator. The black bear is not. It's not as much of a digger. It doesn't dig for it will kind of grub a little bit, but it's not nearly as prodigious. Those claws are built to climb trees. They're not really built so specialized like a grizzly bear to dig. So their claws are shorter, they don't dig as much, and consequently they don't have that shoulder hump. The shape of the face is another way. Grizzly bears tend to have a large round face. A lot of hair around their face makes the ears look small in relation to the head. Black bear faces are quite narrow and the ears look quite large in relation to the head. However, some of the best evidence comes from a track. And so if we get a good track, of a front paw, we can do this little test to figure out whether it's a grizzly bear or black bear. And this works best when it's in a fairly good soft substrate and when it's on a fairly flat slope. Um, so if all those five toes are above that line, so they're kind of pretty much in line with each other, that's a grizzly bear. If one of the toes is behind the line, so four toes are in line, but one is out of line, that's a really good indication of a black bear. So if you remember nothing from my talk tonight, here's what you got to capture. If the toe is back, the bear is black. So put that in your memory bank and use that when you see a track next time out in the woods. Okay, this is a little bit of a test. So you can kind of take a look at this bear. We got this on a remote camera. It's obviously very brown in color. If you look at kind of the shoulder, you can see it looks like a bit of a hump. However, take a hard look at the face. The face is actually quite narrow, and the ears look pretty large. So, what was a bit confusing is I had a number of photos on this camera, and that hump would be it looked like a hump in one photo, and then the next photo it looked like there was no hump. And what was going on was a little bit of a breeze was blowing, and it was blowing the guard hairs across your shoulder up, so that made it look like a hump. So you got to be a little bit careful about that hump when you're trying to figure out what bear you got. Like I mentioned, grizzly bears are really, really phenomenal diggers. This is a grizzly bear dig in Yellowstone. This bear, it looked like a rototiller is probably a 40-foot by 50-foot area, fairly significant area that it just dug up and it was after little roots of spring beauties, in this particular case, in avalanche lilies. It was in the springtime. So they're quite good at digging, and like I say, it's not just, they don't just dig for plants, they often will dig up marmots or other ground squirrels or things like that. One thing that's interesting with grizzly bears is even though they're classified as a carnivore, they actually, it varies depending on where they live, but up to 80% of their diet is not that is vegetation. It's not meat. In many places, a very important food resource is the huckleberry or some sort of shrub producing fruit. Cascades, we have something like 7 different species of huckleberry. They range from fairly low to moderate elevation all the way up to the high elevation meadows. Likely they are going to be in a major food source they certainly are for black bears at certain times of year, and a major source for grizzly bears as well. We've also done some research looking at how climate change might affect huckleberries in terms of their availability of a food source. And while climate change tends to be kind of bad news for many species, it's actually not so bad for grizzly bears. They're such a habitat generalist that they can use a lot of different kinds of habitats. And they also, a lot of the projections show that huckleberry will either maintain or maybe even slightly increase its range within the North Cascades. So the food resources are likely to remain good. We have we've done a lot of intense field work to understand what plant foods are available here in the North Cascades. We've compared those to other areas where they have grizzly bears, and we have some really rich food resources to support grizzly bears here in the North Cascades. A lot of that has to do with just the diversity of our ecosystem, but also the diversity of our moisture regimes, from that really moist west side to the drier east side. So that diversity really adds to the plant base that provide foods for bears. We know that grizzly bears they're quite low in terms of their reproductive output. They're second lowest of all the mammals in North America, right behind the muskox. And the reason for that is because that grizzly bears invest a lot of time and energy in training and in trying to ensure the survival of their cubs, a lot like we do as humans. So a female will probably be 4 to 6 years old before she has her first cubs. Most often she's going to have twins, and she's going to spend 3 or 4 years teaching those cubs everything they need to know about how to make a living in the area that she calls her home range. And that area typically with a female and her cubs is around 100 square miles. A male is going to occupy something like 300 square miles. They cover much bigger ground. But those cubs are real dependent on mom and what she teaches and what they learn from her in terms of their survival. So mom will then probably go a couple years without having cubs again, and then she'll have another litter. So over the course of her life, and typically grizzly bears can remain reproductive until around 16 to 18 years old. They'll often live maybe into their mid-20s in the wild. Um, but she's not going to have a whole lot of chance for having a lot of litters in her time, just because of the time it takes to produce, just to take care of one litter. Those cubs have around a 50-50 chance of making it to adulthood. And by far the most common cause of mortality for grizzly bears are humans. And that can take place anything from getting hit by cars, getting into trouble with our garbage. There's a whole variety of ways in which bears can interact with people. There are other natural causes as well, but the human created mortality is by far the biggest factor. One challenge we have is when bear populations, grizzly bear populations get low, uh, uh, because their reproductive rate is so slow, it's very difficult to recover them. And that's why there's a lot of interest in, how can we help the grizzly bear in the North Cascades is that concern about their small populations and their low reproductive rate. We've learned a lot over the years about how bears interact with their ecosystems. They're used in some cases as an what's called an umbrella species, because they occupy such large area that then a lot of other animals which have smaller area requirements, they're good to go. If we have enough space for grizzly bears, we have enough space for a whole bunch of other species. They they interact a lot with other carnivores. Bears and wolves in Yellowstone had a pretty significant impact when they were in the same ecosystem. They spent a lot of time hunting in the riparian areas. They were displacing elk from those riparian areas. Those riparian areas were getting really overgrazed by elk prior to wolves and bears being there. And that really allowed those riparian habitats to recover once bears and wolves were moving those animals around on the landscape. We know that digging that bears do in meadows is important for maintaining meadow health. It provides a seed bed for plants. And we also know that bears will spread seed. They'll eat berries and they'll spread the seed through their scat. So they do a number of things that kind of cascade across the many parts of the ecosystem. And quite frankly, we're just beginning to understand the role they play in these ecosystems. And one of the exciting things about the North Cascades is if we could have a full complement of these carnivores, we'd have sort of this living laboratory where we could study and understand, how do these ecosystems function when you do have all the pieces in place. So that's kind of an exciting piece as well. Tragedy struck when Conroy, his mind preoccupied with work, stepped into the elevator directly between a female and her cub. This is my slide to sort of transition to talk about bear-people interactions. So we know that there are situations where bears and human interactions don't always turn out so well. There are situations where people are hurt or get attacked by bears. Oftentimes those are associated with surprising a bear or a female protecting her cub or a bear on a food source. There's a variety of things that sort of um, can lend themselves to those situations. I just want to make a really important point in that bear attacks, while they're extremely tragic, they are also extremely rare. If you really look at the number of people that visit bear country and a number of interactions and encounters that occur, 99%, you hike down the trail, the bear hears you, and you may not even know it was there. 99% of those just turn into to nothing. But there are a few cases where there is an encounter, and we've learned through a lot of management and a lot of research that there are ways in which we can minimize the potential for those outcomes to be bad. How we hike in bear country and camp in bear country and interact with bears is really important, and we provide a lot of guidance to people on how to behave in bear country. Couple points I really want to drive home. One is that many of the things that we do for grizzly bears, we should also already be doing in black bear country. We kind of take bears, we don't often take black bears as serious as we should. There are a number of people that get hurt with black bears, so it's something that we should be doing anyway, whether we have grizzly bear recovery here or not. So the other point I want to make is that it is a very rare. I often tell people that if you want to go for a hike in bear country, the most dangerous part of your hike is going to be the drive to the trailhead. And the statistics bear that out. We have a lot of other things that are more threatening than going for a hike in grizzly bear country. So it's important to kind of maintain a perspective around those situations. I shouldn't, but I'm going to have the garbage. So one of probably the most powerful tools that we have is making sure bears don't become habituated to our food and garbage. And they are tenacious. This bear, I have a few photos of this bear, and it sat and looked up at that bird feeder for quite a while, trying to figure out how it was going to get to it. And it finally decided that it was worthwhile to hang upside down and make its way across on this sort of thin rope. All that for a little bit of bird seed. So you can imagine what it's going to do when it has some really good food or garbage available. So again, just doing what we can to separate our food and store it in a way that is not accessible to bears, whether that's at home or in the backcountry, is probably one of the most important things we can do to both keep ourselves safe and keep bears safe. It's really, really critical. This is kind of an idealized version of what a backcountry camp looks like. When we were doing our research in the backcountry, we were carrying some really smelly, stinky stuff that I'll describe to you later, and we made sure we had it either stored in a tree. And many places in the park, there are bear-resistant facilities that you can store things in. So however you need to do it, just making sure that there's some separation between where you're sleeping and camping and where you're doing your food and storing your food. Really, really critical. It's not always in many of our campsites that we can do this 100 yards, but it certainly is. Be thoughtful about where, having some separation. That's what's really important. Okay, I want to shift gears a little bit here. We've talked quite a bit about what grizzly bears are, their ecology, and a little bit about human-bear interactions. And now I want to talk a little bit more about the effort that I participated in this search for grizzly bears in the Cascades. So it's all about the hair. So what do I mean by that? Well, in good old days when we did rare wildlife research, we often relied on this thing we called radiotelemetry. And to put a radio collar on a bear or a wolf or whatever animal, we had to capture it. First we had to capture it, we had to drug it, we had to put it through it was very stressful. It was very stressful on the biologists, and it was very stressful on the animals. Fortunately, we have some other technologies that have really become available in the last 15 or so years as a result of our ability to extract DNA from different parts of an animal, like hair. And it has really opened up the door for biologists to do these studies that are much less invasive to the animal. And so those are the kind of we took advantage of that. We use this thing that we call a hair snare. And a hair snare is nothing more than, we take about 75 feet of barbed wire, your regular old barbed wire. We take that and we put it around some trees till we make kind of a circle that's 25 feet across or so. In the middle of that circle, we put a pile of sticks, and then we put some stuff that we pour over those sticks to attract that bear, to make it nice and stinky so that bear will come in and investigate that. With the idea that if it goes over or under that snare, that wire, it will capture some hair. And we can then grab that hair and analyze the DNA. This is the stinky stuff that we lovingly called goo. Now I got to describe goo because goo was the topic of a lot of conversation amongst our crew members when we were using this. So goo is something that we start making in the fall. We collect roadkill deer, spawned out fish carcasses. We put it in big 50-gallon barrels. Over the course of the winter and into the spring, those solids become liquid, and pretty soon you can stir them in these big barrels. We always put on like extra heavy duty rain gear so we can rinse ourselves off. And by the time spring rolls around, you get this stuff that's kind of this reddish color. It's really, really rancid. It's crazy how bad it smells. But it worked really good. This was actually done by Wayne Caseworm, who's a grizzly bear biologist in Montana. They use it a lot there, and then we started using it here in the Cascades. We knew how well it worked in areas where they have healthy populations of grizzly bears. So Asia has just poured the goo over the pile of sticks, and then we will then Uh, Kristen, Kristen made two mistakes here. She didn't, well, number one, she turned the camera on. Number two, she didn't kind of check the wind when John popped the lid on that bottle of goo, and she got a full-on nose hit of that goo. And I will tell you, especially when we first started using it, it took a little bit getting used to. It hurt. It was painful when you got a full-on nose hit. So we lovingly referred to these as the downwinders whenever somebody took a full-on nose hit from those. And this is Ruben. Ruben just poured some goo over the top of the stick and started running away, but unfortunately, he's got the stinky bottle in his hand, so he's just carrying the stink with him. But we had a lot of fun, kind of uh, um, teasing each other about carrying the goo and getting goo on us. We had one guy who got a little bit of goo on his pant leg, and he promptly took a knife out and cut his pant leg off and put the pant leg on the pile. Went home with a third, three-quarters of a pant leg. It works really well. And this is what we're trying to get out of it is a little piece of a chunk of hair. And we leave these hair snares out for a month. We go back and we collect the hair and we then send that to a lab and they can tell us whether we got a grizzly bear or a black bear. And they can also do a lot of genetic work on black bears. So we could look at how many females and cubs and all that stuff from the genetics. In addition, we used remote cameras. We didn't have enough remote cameras to put them at all our hair snares, but we put them in a lot of places. So we got some really cool photos of other kinds of animals that we're also interested in. It also allowed us to make sure that our hair snares are actually working how we hoped they would. Um, we're also interested in this survey and things like other rare carnivores like wolverines and wolves and that kind of stuff. And the cameras allowed us to do that, and that stinky goo also worked to attract them to some degree, although it's much, much more effective with bears. So we took off and we would go into the wilderness areas. We did multiple trips every year, pretty intensely for about 4 years. And then for about 3 years after that, it was more focused kind of into areas that we hadn't gotten in the previous four and largely dependent on volunteers. But in the first 4 years, we had funding to hire a lot of crew and get people in a lot of different places. And we really tried to get to a lot, in addition to some of the front country sites, but a lot of really remote areas. This is just a few photos from a trip that we did up in the Pasayten. In this particular case, there was a cabin where we could store our goo and our food to keep it away from the bears. But many places we didn't have the luxury of a cabin. Pasayten, we put in 17 miles this day, and by the time Lindsay got into the cabin, she laid down and took a nap. It was a long, hard, hot day, and it was probably one of the more physically challenging projects that I've been involved with, just because the need to carry all that gear into such really remote places. Pretty spectacular country here in the Pasayten. Pasayten, we got again a lot of hits of bears on our hair snares. Um, uh, a little less frequently than in the west side, probably just because the habitat's a little drier. We know that black bears over here, their home ranges are quite a bit bigger, so they're having to search a bit farther to find food compared to what happens on the west side. But again, we got good responses uh, from the hair snares that we put in. Just putting in a hair snare. This is one really, really close to the Canadian border. We also went in on a trip into the west side just to give you another sense. Sometimes it was the weather or the stream crossings, a variety of things that would really challenge our field work. But boy, we got to some spectacular places. A photo taken from Easy Ridge, looking at the north face of Whatcom Peak. Always kept an eye out for bear sign, and in a number of cases we saw a number of black bears. Um, this country is just phenomenal. You can see the vaccinium kind of starting to turn color in the fall, the reddishness, and really phenomenal. I think on this ridge we saw 4 different black bears in our travels. Um, just really grow to appreciate the quality of the bear habitat here in the Cascades. And we got to see some pretty spectacular country, but we had to earn it. Some places were really, really hard to access. Some places we even had to rappel down into to get into the sites we were trying to get to. I love this photo because it's a pretty rare photo. This is looking at the pickets, for those of you that know the park, from the west side, which is not an easy place to get to. But we had hair snares down in these valleys, and you can really see how the vaccinium shrub fields have lit up in the kind of the evening color there. Like I mentioned, we put some cameras out at many of these sites, and we got some pretty interesting photos. This is the black bear during the back rub against the tree. Black bear contemplating what he's going to do about this stinky pile. This is a big bear, probably pushing 400 pounds, that we got a photo of and this is in that easy ridge country that we accessed in the park. I love this photo. When I first got this photo, I popped it up on my computer and I was like, do we have anteaters here in the North Cascades? Because it's just the most unusual looking bear that we got on our camera. It's a little bear, it's not very big, but it has quite the coat color. Never seen anything quite like that except for this little dude. I love this series of photos. We got several photos, mom and two cubs, and these two cubs, they just spread the pile around and then they just rolled in that goo. And you could see when they finally left that their fur was just matted down with that goo. And I had to imagine they just smelled terrible for weeks on end. I'm not sure mom was so happy about that. And then we get photos like this. This was a bear that bit our camera and ripped it off the tree. We got a few other species as well, including some of the rare carnivores that we were interested in. This is quite a ways north in the Pasayten, not too far from the Canadian border. A Canada lynx walked through our camera. Didn't show a lot of interest in the goo, but it did walk through the corral. It's a little bit hard to see, but this is a wolverine down on the very kind of right on the edge of the sun. You can see the light color around the back of the wolverine and its head. That wolverine is at the time was one of the farther southerly detections of a wolverine in the Cascades. Since then, we've detected some even farther. Wolverines seem to be making a pretty significant recovery in the Cascades, which is pretty exciting. And then we did discover a couple of new wolf packs in our cameras as well. So we were successful at documenting the presence of several other of the carnivores that we were interested in. In total, we carried and hauled in and set up over 700 of these hair snares, scattered throughout much of the North Cascades. As you can see, there weren't too many places we didn't get to with our sampling effort. The little green triangles are places where we got bear hair, or excuse me, where we did not get bear hair. The orange circles are places where we did. About 70% of the sites that we put in, we got hair. And we sent all that hair off to the lab, and we did not get a single grizzly bear in all of that effort. So it doesn't bode well for grizzly bears here in the Cascades. We got really help. We did get hair from something like 750 individual black bears. And so from this research, what we've learned, and we certainly can't say there are no bears, but we can definitely say that there aren't very many and that they're not going to make it without some help. And that's really what kicked off the effort to look at different ways of restoring the grizzly bear population of the Cascades, the effort that the Park Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service are undertaking to do an environmental impact study to look at different options to restore the grizzly bear. Again, as I mentioned before, that with just their biology and their reproductive output, that in combination with the fact that even though we used a technique that's quite effective at finding bears, we didn't get any, suggests that if nothing happens, they'll probably become extinct in the North Cascades. And so that's as a result of this work and then the fact that bears are, an endangered species, the federal agencies have undertaken this study to look at options for restoring grizzly bears in the Cascades. That's kind of the end of my story. It's not a happy ending if you're a grizzly bear, but I do want to say that we had dozens of volunteers that helped us with this. I had a kind of a core crew as well that supervised and were just phenomenally dedicated to this effort. Um, uh, it was, like I mentioned before, it was not an easy study physically, but it was extremely rewarding in terms of the amazing country that we got to visit and the relationships that we developed amongst ourselves. So with that, I'll be happy to take questions and yeah, and interact with y'all.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Bill. And we already have a few questions in the chat, so I'm going to
Okay.
go in order here. So our first one is somebody asked, could you repeat what years your studies were conducted during?
Sure. Yeah. Our intensive years were around 2010 to 2014, that period. And then from there till around 2017, we continued, but it was a much more focused effort. Usually it was just a couple of trips a year. And we were leaning very heavily on volunteers at that point in time. So yeah, yeah.
And do you know, I'm going to ask this follow-up question because I had it myself and I figure other folks might be curious as well. Um, if there's been research that's kind of come out of the research you did, like did what you all do lead into additional research studies on bears or on other carnivores in the North Cascades?
Yeah, the research that we did has led, well, the kind of another component of our study was to use the DNA that we collected from black bears to look at how well connected the North Cascades are. We have a number of highways that cross through the North Cascades, and we were able to look at if there was some genetic effect on black bears from those highways. And so there's actually some research papers that are coming out that are in process. And what they have shown is that like the I-90 corridor it's not a complete barrier, but it certainly does limit bear movement. One surprise we had, which I wasn't quite expecting, was there's actually some natural places that limit bear movement. And if you look at if you think about Lake Chelan, and then at the head of Lake Chelan, there's a valley, and then just to the west of that, there's some really mega peaks, Big Peak, Dome Peak, and all those big peaks in there. Um, that valley between the lake and those big peaks is actually pretty critical. It's a pretty critical corridor for animals, including bears. We detected black bears moving through there. Um, uh, but both the lake and those big peaks, they're a bit of a barrier, at least for black bears. Grizzly bears probably not so much because I've seen grizzly bears literally rock climb over amazing terrain. They're a little more adventurous than black bears, but that was a surprise to us to see a bit of a genetic discontinuity that was a natural feature of just the ruggedness of the Cascade. So
Wow.
yeah, good question.
A follow-up that someone asked to that question is, can and do grizzly bears cross big rivers like the Fraser?
Yeah, they do. They're quite good at swimming. Yeah, yeah. Big rivers don't tend to cause too much problem.
Wow. Somebody asked, is the reason there are so many more grizzlies in Montana because they were not hunted there? Were there always more there? Why are we seeing kind of differences in that population size between the two locations?
The good question. They were hunted, but there was some like I think Yellowstone was our first national park, right? So there was some protection that came in place. However, even the Yellowstone population went through a real dramatic decline. In the good old days in Yellowstone, bears were fed at the garbage dumps, and they actually built stadium stands so people could come and watch. And the park decided that was no longer a good idea, and they just cut the food off pretty abruptly. And that bear population declined to probably less than 100 bears or something like that. And it's been steadily increasing. The North Continental Divide ecosystem, which is where our biggest population is, one thing that supports that is there's a very healthy bear population north of the border. So that population's contiguous and large, and so it probably could withstand more of that hunting and trapping than, than some of the others. But even it has grown substantially as a result of really concentrated recovery efforts over the last several decades. So a lot of the populations that are now healthy, like those two, Yellowstone, are a story about successful recovery. So, yeah,
Wow, thank you. We've got lots of questions. This is
great.
fabulous. So the next one is, why do you think that grizzlies don't naturally move south if the food sources are as good as you were describing?
Yeah, so one of the reasons the Cascades is another challenge in recovery is we consider it to be isolated from any other grizzly bear population. So what does that mean? If you just look north of the border, there's no physical barriers, but the numbers of bears are so small. I mean, we're talking probably a handful of bears at most. There's just not much motivation for them to move south. They probably do. They probably do go back and forth across the border, but we didn't detect any on our hair snare. So there's not, if they do, there's not very many. If you go farther north, the North Cascades has kind of on the east side, they kind of pinch together up right around Kamloops. And on the east side is the Okanagan Valley with a lot of development. Very difficult for a bear to get through there. If on the west side, you have the Fraser River Valley, Hope, you have a highway, a community, a train. There's a whole thing. There's quite a gamut of things that a bear has to get through. It's not a complete barrier, actually, but it is probably a real challenge. But the problem is the bears that are north and east there that could potentially move in, their populations are doing very poorly. And again, so you have to go way farther north to get to a healthy bear population. And they're too far away and there are not enough bears for a lot of motivation for them to move and find new territory. So there's just not a place where bears can come from to move into the North Cascades at this point in time. We've done a lot of studying looking at that Fraser Valley as a potential area to, in the future, maybe do some work in there to make that a better linkage. I think that's probably our greatest potential to try to connect the North Cascades to other bear populations is through there.
Cool. And somebody asked a question that relates to that, which is really that if there is this effort to recover bears in the United States in the North Cascades,
Mhm.
does that need to be happening in conjunction with our partners across the border?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and actually it is the in the early stages of recovery, we were first kind of getting going on the U.S. side. The Canadians were actually a bit ahead of us. They actually had a recovery plan, and they were ready to roll. They had some changes in government. The winds blew a different direction, and the recovery sat for a long time politically. It just wasn't going anywhere. That was that would be in the mid 90s to 2000 era. Since then, the Okanagan Nation Alliance has gotten very interested in bear recovery, played a much bigger role because of their tradition they have with bears. And as a result of that, they have a recovery plan and they're probably going to be either right on our heels or slightly even ahead of what's going on the US side. So yeah, that's all good news. As much as those efforts can be coordinated, it will be to the benefit of not only the bear, but the potential for genetic interchange and reducing the need to move more and more bears in is very good, very high, and could be very beneficial just in terms of the complicating factors of the recovery effort. So
Cool. Related to that, somebody asked if you could speak to where we're at in the EIS process and that effort to recover bears.
sure, I can speak generally to it. So the environmental impact study was presented out to the public this fall. It was out for a comment period. So and this is the second comment period. They had a couple other comment periods years back as well. This comment period, as I understand right now, the comment period closed. It was a 90-day comment period. It closed, I think it was sometime in November. And the agencies received lots of comments like they usually do on these in these efforts, probably several thousand of them. And their role now is to go through those comments and decide which comments are things that they can address in their final, basically their final decision. So they'll look at things, they'll make sure, if there's new biology or new information they need to consider, they'll modify their final decision based on that public input. My last understanding and connection with some of that team was that they were expecting that final decision to come out sometime this spring. So probably in the next few months.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
Also related to that question, somebody asked, kind of in this potential future where grizzlies return in number to the North Cascades, what is the estimate of what population size would ideally be supported by the habitat here?
Yeah, it's a great question. We actually did some research on this for the recovery team. And we did some fancy population models, all that nerdy biology stuff. And what we came up with was that we could probably, the way you have to think about this is there's the Cascades have phenomenal habitat, but they also have a lot of people. And we had to factor in, yeah, we have this great habitat, but we need to modify that by people and presence. And if you kind of think, a lot of there's some places like where I live outside of Leavenworth, the Alpine Lakes Wilderness is heavily used. So we need to think about bears differently there than up in the Pasayten and some of the North Cascades Park where it's pretty lonely country. So we added that human component to our model to try to address that. And what we came up with was probably somewhere between 250 and 400 bears is what the ecosystem could support given the human activities. So that helped the recovery team set a goal. I think their goal is around 250 bears, what they would call a recovered population. Now, we are decades and decades from anywhere near that. And even if we hit 250, that density of bears would still be the lowest density, way lower than what's going on presently in Yellowstone or or Glacier Park, much, much lower. So it's a fairly conservative estimate, if you will.
Thank you. We've got a few questions that are kind of more about bear biology. So
Great.
one of them is a two-parter. Are there any, I think it's Kermode or spirit bears in the North Cascades? And then the follow-up to that is, are genetic tests sensitive enough to differentiate those individuals?
The Kermode bears are unique to coastal British Columbia, and no, we don't have any. I'm not even aware of any evidence that would suggest historically they were here either, but there are genetic tests that would allow us to do that. Yeah, yeah.
Nice. The next person asked, you mentioned that grizzlies and bears often have twins. Why is it that that is the most frequent number of babies?
That's a great question. I don't know. Yeah, I'm not really sure. I I'm assuming, evolutionarily, it's to the benefit of that female to have as many as possible, but at the same time, too many, probably their survival, so it's probably somewhere around two where the effort it takes and the survival payoff is my educated guess. Yeah, it's a good question. Once in a while, you'll see three or even four. It's really rare. And once in a while, you'll see one, but by far the most common is two.
Yeah. Wow. This next person is mentioning a recent visit to Glacier National Park, and how frequent bear interactions with hikers are there.
Mhm.
And they're thinking about this potential reintroduction of grizzlies to the North Cascades. And they're curious, about how grizzly recovery would work with all the human traffic. And you mentioned this a little bit, but are you able to elaborate a little more on what strategies managers might consider employing to mitigate conflict between bears and humans?
Sure, sure. So the first is going to be thinking about in the initial recovery efforts, which bears we bring in and where we put them. So there's been a lot of the recovery team has done they have criteria about bears with no history of problems, probably a mix of young females because they have many reproductive years, some males because there's no guarantee there's a male out there. Um, and 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 then as important to that is places that are very remote. And so but really good habitat. And there's lots of that. I can vouch for that personally because I've been to those places. So that's number one. Now, as the population grows, the the really important component is that every bear needs a radio collar on it. And when a bear gets into a place where it could potentially be in trouble, it's actively moved. And that's why I know this is a geeky sounding terminology, but in the recovery restoration plan, there's this thing called experimental population. And what that does is it gives the managers more flexibility to do things like moving bears when they're not in the place they want, right? So if that's one of the main features there. Um, as important for managing the bears is the people part and education, 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 things like this, but trailhead education, you cannot do enough of that. So it's a combination of managing the bears very closely, but also then managing people. And I think the other third part is, and this is where we addressed it in the work that we did, is um, thinking about our recovery goals in relation to how many people are there. So the number of bears we can support in the Alpine Lakes Wilderness is a lot fewer than what we can do in the Pasayten, just because of the human impacts. And we need to be able to account for that.
Awesome. And I just changed it so people could see your face a little
Great,
better.
great.
Um, all right. So our next question, someone was asking if people are reintroducing or various plants into maybe habitat near where grizzlies could be in the future. What are some plants that are important to the grizzlies?
Yeah, so a lot of berry producing shrubs. Huckleberries is probably the top, but they'll use serviceberry. There's other shrub producing. In the springtime, it's going to be things that grow roots and tubers, avalanche lilies, spring beauties, those sort of things. In other ecosystems, the white bark pine nut is quite tasty to grizzly bears. There's a lot of work going on to try to help the white bark pine out here because of the white pine blister rust that is killing it. Um, so yeah, there's several examples there. They'll dig up the challenge. When we looked at all the bear foods that grizzly bears eat and we compared that to the plant list we developed from the Cascades, we found over 120 different species of plants that bears are known to eat. And that's why we have such a rich diversity of habitats here, So yeah.
Related to that, can you speak at all to like elevational use of a grizzly through maybe a year?
Yeah.
'Cause I know in hearing some of the public comment during this most recent EIS, people expressed a lot of concern about bears just sticking in the lowlands, where
Mm,
you also
mhm,
see a higher
mhm.
concentration of human populations.
Yeah, yeah. Typically, grizzly bears they're a little bit different. Black bears and grizzly bears do different things. Black bears typically will den in more of a forested environment. They basically lay down under a root wad and let the snow cover them up. Grizzly bears are much more particular. They're going to den up in the high country. They like to dig a den. They're quite particular about where they dig it because they want enough soil they can actually dig up and build a platform. A lot of times they line it with grass and stuff, but they want the cold air to drain out. So you need to have fairly good soil depth for that kind of thing. Um, they're going to be up in tree line or higher, typically. There's always going to be an exception, but typically. And then in the springtime, they pop out when the snow starts to melt. Usually the males come out a little before the females, probably March to April, so that area and that time in there. And then they do oftentimes move down to below the snow line. That's where the grass is green. That's where the grass and forbs are starting to, to come on, and they got some food. They'll take if they see, uh, this is probably the time when they hunt more for deer fawns and calves and that kind of stuff. It's probably the time when meat is a bigger portion. But then as the spring rolls on, they're gonna follow that snow line right on up. They like to feed right on the edge of that where that fresh green vegetation is the most nutritious. So that's the typical pattern, is this sort of, cyclic pattern of gradual moving up in elevation until they get there in the fall. I have seen bears in the fall. A lot of it depends on the timing of when the berries kind of dry up and when the snow comes. Because when the snow comes, hibernation is basically it's an adaptation to get through periods when food isn't available. And so bears on the southern end of their range, like black bears down in Mexico, don't hibernate very long. Whereas on the farther north, the longer the hibernation period. Um, but that again is to get through that era of that period of no food. So in the fall, they go through this thing called hyperphagia, both black bears and grizzly bears, where it basically is a fancy term for eat everything they can get their paws on. I've seen black bears in the Cascades feed 24 hours a day and night in a berry field, just concentrated on that food, putting weight on. They put a lot of their weight and their fat on that they survive through the winter during that time. So that's kind of a crucial time. So there's times when those berries aren't available. Then bears can move down, and a lot of times they like to move down into river valleys where there's water and there's green vegetation. So it a lot of it depends on that's a kind of a year-to-year variation.
Thank you. Somebody wants to know, were there grizzly bears in the Olympic Mountains in
Mhm.
Washington? And are there any studies or efforts being made towards recovery in the Olympics?
So it's a great question. There is not archaeological evidence to suggest there were grizzly bears there. We've had a lot of debate. We've had some debate about that because why wouldn't there have been? And historically there was probably no barrier. So there's a bit of I think there's still a bit of a question mark on that. But as at least as of now, we don't have confirmed archaeological evidence that they were there. And so there's no recovery effort underway there.
Mm. Um, Another question related to kind of population size is how many individual bears would be needed to minimally maintain genetic diversity in a North Cascades grizzly population?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's not an easy question to answer because a lot of it depends on, are we trying to maintain diversity in the short term or the long term? If it's short term, we can probably get away with, that 250. If they when they get there, it's probably going to be able to maintain itself for quite a while. In the long term, maybe not. What we're going to need to do is figure out how can we reconnect that population to others. One thing though is I think we've learned from years of research is that bears and other large carnivores are more resilient in terms of genetic issues than we thought. For example, in Yellowstone, where they went through a pretty severe bottleneck when they closed the dumps, they have in their recovery plan, if genetic diversity declines, to move bears from like the North Continental Divide and add to that genetic diversity. But again, thankfully, with all the genetic monitoring we're doing now, they haven't had a need to do that. So it might suggest that they're more resilient than we thought. Um, yeah, we're a long ways in the Cascades from anything that's going to be sustainable genetically. It will take decades to reach a level where we don't have to think about monitoring the genetic diversity and making sure that thinking about, you know, which bears we bring as part of that restoration effort and where they come from and that diversity that provides. So that'll be something that'll have to be monitored for sure for a long time. It's a good question.
Yeah, thank you. The last question I'm going to share for tonight before doing a quick wrap up is if people want to get engaged, if they want to learn more about grizzly bears, or if they want to share their voice in the process of reintroduction, or maybe even get involved. You said you had volunteers working on your study. What are some ways people can get involved around grizzly bears?
Yeah, so one is go hiking and take your camera, and if you find something, send it to me because I'm curious. So keep your aware of your environment. Look for tracks. Look for, if you find something, there's several, it's not just me, there's many biologists be very, very interested because we've spent most of our career trying to find one out there. So that's one. But secondly, there's not a lot of my field work is pretty well wrapped up, but I think the other way to get it there are other efforts if you're willing uh, in other ecosystems like wing caseworm in the cabinet yak where they have more ongoing recovery actions that people get involved with. I hope we get there here. I would love to have a crew of volunteers monitoring a bear that's flummered and wandering around the Cascades. And then in terms of getting involved in the recovery planning, my guess is that the final decision will come out this spring, and if so, it'll be up to kind of that administration and the agency leaders to determine if they're going to have another public comment period or whether they've gotten what they need. So that I think it's kind of wait and see on that. But get engaged because in my view, grizzly bear recovery is only part about the bear. It's about these phenomenal ecosystems that are in our backyard that we all need to take care of. And so get engaged, if not about bears, but about the health of our ecosystems, because there's things like climate change and other things, there are other kinds of research that people get involved in, monitoring the change of glaciers over time that are really important, irregardless of what happens with grizzly bear recovery, because these wild areas are special. So,
Wow. Thank you so much, Bill, for joining us tonight. Thank you, everyone watching from home or from wherever you are for tuning in tonight. And I've got just one final thing to share, which is that you all have engaged tonight in some amazing education and opportunity to learn. The North Cascades Institute offers many different types of programming, including field-based courses where we go out into the field and learn about things like carnivores out in these beautiful spaces in Northwestern Washington. And so I'm going to share my screen here for just a moment. If you're interested in getting engaged in future classes, our upcoming courses this winter, we've got a bald eagles course in the Skagit Valley that's happening this coming weekend, and a painting the Pacific Northwest in watercolor. That's a multi-part series. It's a virtual class. We also have a bird series that will kick off in mid-February. And those are just a few of the upcoming programs. You can go to our website to learn more about how to engage and about the other work that we do up in the North Cascades. So thank you everyone for tuning in tonight. I'll stay on for just a moment in case anyone has anything final to mention in the chat there. But Bill, thank you again so much for joining us, and have a great night, everyone.
thank you, everyone. Thank you, Hannah. Really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for joining.